Most people would never expect to find ash, herbs, or mold anywhere near their food, especially not in cheese. But for traditional cheesemakers, these materials could help transform ordinary milk into a product with a stronger flavor, a longer shelf life, and a distinctive rind. The important detail is that medieval cheesemakers did not use all three materials in one universal recipe, and they did not always add them directly to the milk. Ash could change the surface environment, herbs could add flavor, and natural microorganisms could guide the cheese through aging. The real story is not about random ingredients. It is about observation, patience, and learning how to control a living food. Cheese began as a practical solution to the short life of fresh milk. Milk is nutritious, but in a world without refrigeration, it could spoil quickly, especially during warm weather. By separating milk into curds and whey, then draining, salting, pressing, and drying the curds, people could create a food that remained usable for much longer. That did not happen through one sudden invention. Cheesemaking developed gradually as people discovered that different temperatures, vessels, herbs, storage rooms, and aging surfaces produced different results. Over time, cheese became more than preserved milk. It became a food shaped by local knowledge and repeated practice. The cheesemaker did not have microscopes, laboratory equipment, or modern food science textbooks. They could not identify bacteria by name, and they did not know that different fungi could influence the aroma and texture of a cheese. What they could do was observe. They knew which cheeses aged well in a cool room, which ones became too dry, which surfaces encouraged a desirable rind, and which batches developed unpleasant growth. When a method worked, it was repeated. When a method failed, it was changed or abandoned. In this way, traditional cheesemaking became a form of practical science, even though the invisible organisms behind the process were not yet understood. Ash is often treated as a decorative feature because of the dramatic dark stripe it can create inside a pale cheese. But ash can also change the chemistry of a cheese's surface. Ash made from burned plant material is alkaline, while many fresh cheeses become more acidic as the milk changes into curds. Applying ash can raise the pH of the surface and create conditions that favor certain microorganisms. A simple way to understand this is to think about soil. Different plants prefer different soil conditions, and different microorganisms prefer different cheese conditions. By changing the surface environment, ash could influence which organisms became active during ripening. One microorganism associated with certain ash-ripened cheeses is Geotrichum candidum, a yeast-like fungus that can grow on cheese surfaces under suitable conditions. It prefers an environment that is not strongly acidic, which helps explain why changing the surface with ash can affect the development of a rind. This does not mean medieval cheesemakers understood the organism or deliberately measured it into every batch. They were working with the microorganisms already present in their milk, tools, rooms, and surroundings. Their skill came from learning which conditions encouraged a desirable result and which conditions led to spoilage. Before we continue, if you are enjoying this closer look at the real history behind traditional cheese, take a moment to like the video. It helps more viewers discover carefully researched food history. And if you want more stories about how familiar foods were made and preserved, subscribe to Origins of Cheese. Now, let's look at why some cheeses developed a dark ash stripe through the center, and why that line may have started as a practical cheesemaking method rather than a decoration. The internal ash stripe found in certain cheeses has a particularly interesting history. One explanation is that ash was placed between separate portions of curd when cheesemakers were collecting milk at different times. The ash could act as a visible dividing layer while the cheesemaker waited for another portion to be added. Later, the two portions were pressed together, leaving a dark line through the finished cheese. This explanation should not be treated as a universal fact for every ash-striped cheese, but it helps show how a practical method can survive as a visual tradition. In some modern cheeses, the stripe may be more about identity and history than function. Herbs served a different purpose from ash. Medieval gardens commonly contained plants used for seasoning and other household needs, and local herbs could give familiar foods a distinctive character. Cheese was an ideal food for this kind of variation because a basic curd could be changed with small amounts of available ingredients. Depending on the plant, herbs could add freshness, bitterness, sweetness, or a sharp aromatic note. A cheesemaker might use herbs to make a product taste different from the cheese made in a neighboring village. Before modern labels and standardized recipes, local ingredients helped define where a food came from. However, it would be inaccurate to suggest that every medieval cheese contained herbs or that all regions followed the same recipe. Medieval cheesemaking covered many centuries and many different parts of Europe, and surviving evidence is uneven. Some traditions clearly used herbs for flavor, while other cheeses depended mainly on milk quality, salt, aging conditions, or the local environment. The careful conclusion is that herbs were available culinary ingredients that could influence the taste and identity of some cheeses. They were not a universal requirement. This distinction matters because food history often turns a regional practice into a story about an entire period. Mold is the most misunderstood part of this story. It is easy to imagine medieval cheesemakers leaving cheese in a damp room and accepting whatever happened. Skilled cheesemakers were doing something more careful. They watched which rinds developed pleasant aromas and attractive textures, and they noticed which cheeses became damaged or unpleasant. Moisture, salt, temperature, air movement, storage surfaces, and aging time all affected the result. Mold was not automatically good, and it was not automatically bad. What mattered was which organism was present, how much of it developed, and whether the surrounding conditions produced a cheese people considered desirable. Modern research shows that cheese ripening involves a changing community of microorganisms from the milk, the environment, the equipment, and the aging space. Some fungi and other organisms contribute to desirable aromas, textures, and rinds, while others can damage the cheese or create safety concerns. Scientific reviews have discussed organisms including Geotrichum candidum, mucor, and Trichothecium roseum in connection with natural cheese ripening environments. That does not mean all of them are desirable in every cheese. It means that ripening is a biological process, and the final result depends on the conditions surrounding the cheese as it ages. Ash, herbs, and natural mold were not magical ingredients. Their importance came from control. Ash could influence the acidity of a cheese's surface. Herbs could create a recognizable flavor. Natural microorganisms could guide the cheese through aging. The cheesemaker's job was to create conditions that encouraged the desired process and limited the unwanted one. This is also why saying that medieval cheesemakers simply added mold to milk is too simple. In many traditional cheeses, mold developed during ripening rather than being measured into the milk like salt. The milk mattered, but the room, the tools, and the aging surface mattered too. A cellar, cave, wooden shelf, cloth, or storage room could influence the character of the finished cheese. Over many batches, the local environment helped establish a familiar microbial pattern. This is one reason cheeses from different regions could develop different aromas and textures even when the starting ingredient was simply milk. Traditional cheesemaking was connected to place, the climate, the animals, the plants, the water, the wood, the stone, and the habits of the cheesemaker all played a role. The result was not just a recipe, it was a relationship between ingredients, surroundings, and time. Many cheese stories have been repeated for generations. Some preserve a useful memory of an old method, while others simplify a complicated process into one dramatic explanation. An ash stripe may reflect an older production practice, but its exact origin is not confirmed for every modern cheese. A household may have used herbs in cheese, but that does not prove every region followed the same recipe. A mold-covered cheese may have matured successfully, but that does not mean every mold was safe or desirable. The strongest conclusions come from combining historical descriptions, surviving traditions, and scientific research, rather than relying on one appealing story. Modern cheesemaking is more controlled than it was during the Middle Ages. Cheesemakers can select cultures, test ingredients, monitor temperature, control humidity, and follow food safety procedures. These controls matter because uncontrolled microorganisms can create genuine risks. Traditional does not automatically mean safe, and natural does not automatically mean beneficial. At the same time, the basic principles remain familiar. Acidity, salt, moisture, air, temperature, surfaces, and microorganisms still determine how cheese develops. Modern science has explained the process more precisely, but it has not replaced the importance of observation and timing. The medieval cheesemaker did not have a laboratory, but careful observation gave them a working understanding of the same forces that modern science now explains. Ash was not merely a dark stripe. Herbs were not always decoration. Mold was not automatically spoilage. Each one could influence the conditions under which cheese developed, but only when used with knowledge of timing, environment, and purpose. That is the real reason these unusual materials mattered. They reveal a food tradition built on patience, local knowledge, and repeated observation. Cheese was not simply milk that had been solidified. It was milk transformed by time and a carefully managed living environment. If this story changed the way you look at cheese, leave a comment telling me which ingredient you would have trusted least: ash, herbs, or mold. Subscribe to Origins of Cheese for more carefully researched stories about the foods people made, preserved, and passed down through history. The next time you see an unusual cheese rind or a dark line running through a cheese wheel, remember that you may be looking at the surviving evidence of an old cheesemaking decision.